G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Faith Foundations. In this session, we'll be looking at the remnant of Israel, past, present, and future, which is one of the teachings of RL's Come and See series, put out by Dr. Alan Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. So we're now, this new study, the remnant of Israel, past, present, and future. We're going to set off in the first part of it. It's going to be at least a 4-part series. There's a lot to cover. I say then, this is Romans 11:1. I say then, did God cast off his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. That's Paul talking about himself there. Now, what is the remnant? What's the meaning of the remnant? Well, the doctrine of the remnant of Israel means that there are always some who believe within the Jewish nation as a whole, and all those who believe, they're the ones who constitute the remnant of Israel. So there are two Israels. There's Israel the whole, which is all Jewish people, all of Israel, and then Israel the remnant. You know, ethnically, the two are the same, both Jews, but spiritually they're not. The remnant at any point of history may be large or small, but there is never ever a time when it is non-existent, except it will be non-existent immediately after the rapture, because there'll be no believers on the earth at that time. Now, what's the ramifications? There are 5 ramifications concerning the remnant of Israel. First of all, only believers make up the remnant, only Jewish believers. Secondly, not all believers are part of the remnant. Again, for the remnant, it's a Jewish remnant and is therefore made up of only Jewish believers. Third thing, the remnant is always part of the nation as a whole. It's not detached from the nation as a separate entity. The remnant is distinct, but it is actually distinct within the nation. And fourthly, this means that Jewish believers have a dual citizenship. They're part of both Israel and the church, because as a believer, they're part of the church. And then the 5th ramification is that within this concept of the remnant, there is a twofold contrast. And we're going to see that as we go through. There's going to be a contrast between the miraculous and the non-miraculous, and a contrast between the noise and the quiet. I'll show you what we mean when we start going through. So the concept of the remnant was apparent, a remnant of Israel was apparent from the very beginning of Israel's history as they began to multiply. Now, as a doctrine, the theology of the remnant actually began with Elijah the prophet, and it was then developed by the writing prophets and then continued right on through the New Testament. Now, we're going to look at Israel, the remnant in the past, and then we're going to see what we can glean from this. Well, we see Elijah, as we said, it began with Elijah. We in 1 Kings 16, verse 29 to 1 Kings 19:18. Now we're going to see that there's a new religious system comes into play in 1 Kings 16. Now we had a king called Omri. Not only was there a new capital of Israel, Samaria, but there was also a new dynasty. However, this Omri continued in the sin of Jeroboam. Now remember Jeroboam, what was his sin? Well, he introduced the worship of the golden calf, and we find it in 1 Kings 12, 25 to 33. Now, Jeroboam's sin was not a totally foreign religion, but Jeroboam's sin was actually a corruption of the true one. Why? It was a corruption of Jehovah worship in that it reduced the God of Israel to an idol. And in fact, when Jeroboam introduced the worship of the golden calf, he did so by using the same words that Aaron used when he introduced his golden calf. This is the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 32, verse 4, we find that. In verses 29 to 34 of 1 Kings 16, when Omri's son Ahab ascended to the throne, remember Ahab, he now married a Phoenician princess from Sidon called Jezebel, and with her there is now the introduction of an altogether new religion, and this was the worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm god. So the whole religious system of Israel changed radically, and so God and so did God's relationship to the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, into this new environment, God now called Elijah, whose life, as we're going to see, was a life of paradoxes and ironies. Now, what's the historical event that gave rise to the doctrine? Well, we see that in 1 Kings 17. So now, because of Israel's worship of Baal, God now decreed a drought over the nation in verses 1 to 7 of 1 Kings 17. And in this manner, the ministry of Elijah is now introduced. This is the first contrast that we're going to see between the miraculous and the non-miraculous. Food is miraculously provided for Elijah by means of ravens, but water is non-miraculously provided by means of a brook. But eventually, with the drought, the brook also dries up. So obviously, God could have easily provided the water miraculously for one man, as he did for 2 million in the wilderness over that 40-year period when they were wandering. But God does not always choose to work miraculously. So instead, in verse 8 of 1 Kings 17, God told Elijah to leave the country of Israel and head north to Phoenicia, to the widow of Zarephath. And this was a town belonging to Sidon. So this is the first of many ironies in the life of Elijah, because remember, Jezebel came from Sidon to Israel. Now Elijah went from Israel to Sidon. And because of Jezebel, Jews are now worshipping Baal, the god of Sidon. Because of Elijah, by the end of this chapter, chapter 17, Sidonians are now going to be worshipping the God of Israel. So here we have these ironies. In 1 Kings 18, we're going to have a divine duel here. What happened was that when the drought had reached its most severe, in verses 1 to 24 of 1 Kings 18, God sent Elijah back to Israel for a contest with the prophets of Baal. And the terms of the contest are for Israel to decide once and for all who is God. If Baal proves to be God, then let all Israel continue to worship Baal. But if Jehovah proves to be God, then let all Israel repudiate the worship of Baal and then return to Jehovah worship alone. So this event now provides a second contrast. And this is going to be the contrast between the noise and the quiet. In verse 29 of 1 Kings 18, the prophets of Baal go first and are characterized by lots of noise. But as noisy as they get, the heavens remain silent. No God speaks to them from the heavens. And when it is Elijah's turn, he does everything in a quiet way. He rebuilds an altar and praying a simple prayer. But in response to Elijah's quietness, the heavens become noisy, and in verse 38, fire from heaven consumes the entire sacrifice in spite of its being drenched with water. So Jehovah, the God of Israel, has proven himself to be God. What happens? The prophets of Baal are now slain, and the drought comes to an end. But this doesn't sit well with Jezebel. So now we see in 1 Kings 19, we're going to see the flight of Elijah out of Israel. This is 1 Kings 19, verses 1 to 8. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do so to me and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. When he saw that, he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself, Elijah, went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, O Jehovah, take away my life, for I'm not better than my fathers. Okay. So Elijah's victory turned a bit sour when Jezebel threatened his life. And in verses 1 to 4, Elijah understood her actions to mean that Israel would not repudiate the worship of Baal and fled Israel for Judah. And so he's in a very depressed state, and he entered the Negev desert and he prayed to die. Here's another irony in Elijah's life. He's actually the only prophet who asked God to take his life. But in the end, Elijah will not die at all. And verse 5 says, he lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baken on the coals, and a cruse of water. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. Angel of Jehovah came again the second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights onto Horeb, the mount of God. So, we see now in verses 5 to 8, instead of dying, he was fed twice by an angel and continued his journey to Mount Sinai, where he had a unique encounter with God. Mount Sinai, remember, is the place where God entered into a covenantal relationship with Israel. And there, God warned Israel not to worship any other God, and Israel committed herself to obeying all that God commanded. Now we're going to see Elijah's first complaint in 1 Kings 19, 9 to 10. And he came thither unto a cave, and he lodged there. And behold, the word of Jehovah came to him, and he said unto him, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for Jehovah, the God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So in verse 9 of 1 Kings 19, God asked Elijah the purpose of his coming to Mount Sinai, where the Mosaic covenant was made. And in verse 10, Elijah's response was his first complaint. And this is a severe indictment against Israel by a prophet who suffered and struggled to bring the nation to repentance, but it just didn't work. And if this type of indictment were true, it would now require divine discipline. So we see God's response in verses 11 to 13. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before Jehovah. And behold, Jehovah passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before Jehovah. But Jehovah was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But Jehovah was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Jehovah was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. So God's response to Elijah's first indictment was to send 3 noisy things that did not contain the presence of God, and then a fourth, a quiet thing that did. It was a still small voice. Now Elijah's response was he wrapped his face in his mantle, and this was a very common Jewish reaction whenever one thought he might be in the presence of God. Now, in second part of verse 13 to verse 18, we now see the interpretation of what Elijah has just been told. And we see Elijah's second complaint in verse 13 and 14. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for Jehovah, the God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thy altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So in verse 13, God again asked Elijah why he came to Mount Sinai. Elijah responded in verse 14, again issuing the same indictment against Israel. Now in verses 15 to 18, we see God's answer. And Jehovah said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, thou shalt anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah shalt thou anoint to be a prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. Yet will I leave me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which have not kissed him. So we see here in verses 15 to 18, we see that the parallel of these verses are with verses 11 to 13. In response to Elijah's second indictment against Israel in verse 17, God will send three noisy things against Israel. Now, while he'll send all three noisy things, God's presence was not in them. The first was Hazael, king of Syria, who corresponds to the wind. Just as the wind beat against a mountain, Hazael beat against Israel until he reduced Israel's holding considerably. He took a lot of land away from them. 2 Kings 8, 7 to 15 and 10, 32 to 33, and 2 Kings 13, 3 and 22 to 25 tells us the story there. The second noisy thing was Jehu, who corresponds to the earthquake. And again, just as the earthquake split the mountain, Jehu caused a civil war that totally destroyed the dynasty and house of Ahab, as well as royal members of the house of Judah. Again, the story of this is 2 Kings 9, verse 1 to 2 Kings 10, verse 36. The third noisy thing was Elisha, who corresponds to the fire. Now, just as fire burned against a mountain, Elisha burned against Israel. For often wherever Elisha went, death followed him. 2 Kings 2, 23 to 24, that tells a little story there. But God did send all three noisy things, but again, God's presence was not in them. And then in verse 18, God then tells Elijah that he was not the only one left who was faithful, for God had 7,000 others, and these 7,000 were the remnant of that day, quite small when compared to the nation as a whole. Now, the remnant corresponds to the still small voice of verse 12. Now, the remnant, in contrast to Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha, is the quiet thing. So quiet that Elijah did not know they even existed. They were so quiet. So God's presence was in this remnant. And it was with this historical remnant, the 7,000 of Elijah's day, that the doctrine of the remnant of Israel actually began. Now we move on to the book of Emmanuel, which we see in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 1 to chapter 12, verse 6. It's now Isaiah the prophet who put the remnant concept into theological terms. It is found mostly in the unit composed of chapters 7 to 12 called the book of Emmanuel. In the Hebrew text, this name is found 3 times, in Isaiah 7 verse 14 and 8 verse 8 and also 8 verse 10. In Isaiah chapter 7 verses 3 to 9, Isaiah told Ahaz, king of Judah, not to fear. He was to trust with quiet confidence in the God of Israel. But instead, Ahaz chose to trust in the noisy Assyrian army to save him. Now, building on the contrast of the noise and the quiet, Isaiah chapter 8 verses 5 to 8 now points out that the non-remnant tends to put its trust in that which is noisy, such as the Assyrian army. But the remnant has a quiet confidence in the God of Israel and the one to come, who is Emmanuel, God with us. And this is contrasted in this passage by the waters of Shiloah that flow quietly as over against a noisy Euphrates river. Ultimately, the noise will destroy the non-remnant, but Emmanuel will save the believers according to Isaiah 8 verses 9 to 11. Emmanuel will thus become the point of division between the remnant and the non-remnant. In Isaiah chapter 8 verses 14 to 15, Emmanuel will now prove to be a sanctuary for the remnant, but for the non-remnant, Emmanuel will prove to be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. In Isaiah 8, 14 to 15, he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble thereon and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. So in Isaiah's day, what separated the remnant from the non-remnant was their attitude toward the law and the prophets. In Isaiah 8, 16 to 17, the remnant placed its trust in the law and the prophets and waited upon the Lord. But the non-remnant didn't. So important was the doctrine of the remnant to Isaiah that in Isaiah 7 verse 3, he named one of his sons Shear-Jashub, which means a remnant shall return. And with that naming in Isaiah 10 verses 20 to 23, Isaiah was now looking forward to the future final salvation of the remnant of Israel. Until then, it was God who protected the remnant and guaranteed its survival, according to Isaiah 46, 3 to 4. Isaiah 46, 3 to 4 says, "Hearken unto me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, that have been born by me from their birth, that have been carried from the womb. Even to old age I am he, and even to hoar hairs will I carry you. I have made and I'll bear you. I'll carry and will deliver." So, in the future, Emmanuel will be the new point of division between the remnant and the non-remnant. Now, that was the past. What about the present today? The doctrine of the remnant of Israel teaches that there is always a segment of the Jewish people who are believers. The teaching of the New Testament is that the remnant of Israel today is composed of Jewish believers in the Messiahship of Yeshua, Jesus. In the New Testament, that doctrine is found primarily in Paul's Israelology of Romans 9, 10, and 11. There's one other passage on the remnant of Israel relevant to Israel present, and that's 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. Let's look at 1 Peter 2, 1 to 10 first. In 1 Peter 1, verses 1 to 2, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the elect who are sojourners of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ, grace to you and peace be multiplied. By taking Peter's words literally, it is clear that this epistle was not written to the church at large, nor to a body of Gentile believers, but to Jewish believers living outside the land within a majority Gentile population. Not once does Peter ever use the term church in this epistle. This is the first epistle. The term dispersion of 1 Peter 1, verse 1, is a technical Jewish term for Jews who live outside the land. It is used twice elsewhere, John 7, verse 35 and James 1, verse 1, which all commentators agree refer to the Jews of the diaspora. There is no reason then to make 1 Peter the exception, since it fits well into Peter's calling as the apostle to the circumcision. Galatians 2, 7 to 8 tells us that. Furthermore, Peter keeps making reference to the fact that his readers live among the Gentiles. We see that in 1 Peter 2, 12 and 1 Peter 4, 3. Now, while many try to make the term Gentiles means unbelievers, that's never its Jewish usage, nor even the New Testament usage, as a look in any concordance will show you. Peter is using the term Gentile in its normal usage of non-Jew. Peter is addressing Jewish believers living among a majority Gentile population. Expressions such as vain manner of life and handed down from your fathers, 1 Peter 1:18, that has clear Jewish overtones. It's distinguishing these Jewish believers from their past lives in rabbinic Judaism. That's what that is saying. And in this section of the epistle, Peter now draws a contrast between the remnant and the non-remnant. And his purpose is to show that while the non-remnant has failed in its calling, the remnant has not. So when what Peter states here may not necessarily be true of the church as a whole, but it is true specifically of Jewish believers who now make up the remnant of Israel. In 1 Peter 2, 1 to 3, we see the spiritual state of the remnant. Putting away, therefore, all wickedness and all guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speakings, as newborn babes long for the spiritual milk which is without guile, that you may grow thereby unto salvation, if you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Peter's statements show that he's writing to the Jewish believers who are in need of the spiritual milk of the Word of God. You see the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 10. So now, after he's describing the spiritual state of the remnant in verses 1 to 3, Peter now then deals with the topic of the stone of stumbling and the rock of offense. 1 Peter 2, 4, unto whom coming a living stone, rejected indeed of men, but with God elect, precious. Messiah, Yeshua, is described as the living stone, who though rejected by men is elect and precious with God. In 1 Peter 2, verse 5, we see the status of the remnant. You also, as living stones, are built up a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, going back into Exodus with Exodus 19, verses 5 to 6, Peter has this clearly in mind. And Peter states that because of the kind of salvation they have, Jewish believers are two things. First, they're living stones, and as such are part of a spiritual house. This spiritual house is the spiritual house of Israel, the remnant of Israel, or in Paul's words, the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16. Second, Jewish believers are a holy priesthood. This too was the calling of the nation as a whole, which you see back in Exodus 19. The nation failed, but the remnant of Israel has not failed and is today offering spiritual sacrifices to the Lord. Now, what's the distinction between the remnant and the non-remnant? 1 Peter 2, 6 to 8 tells us this. To explain the distinction now between the remnant and the non-remnant, Peter begins with the status of the remnant in verses 6 to the first part of verse 7. Because it is contained in Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious. And he that believes in him shall not be put to shame. For you therefore that believe is the preciousness. So verse 6 here is a quotation from Isaiah 28, verse 16. And it's to point out that the chief cornerstone is the Messiah, who is elect and precious before God the Father. And those who believe in him will not be ashamed. And then in the first part of verse 7, he then makes the application and he states that while the messianic stone is indeed precious, it is only precious for the remnant, not for the non-remnant. Concerning the non-remnant, we see this in the second part of verse 7 and verse 8. But for such as disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, the same was made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. So in the second part of verse 7, Peter quotes from Psalm 118, verse 22. And that's to show that the messianic stone that would be rejected by the leaders of Israel was already predicted. And in the first part of verse 8, he quotes Isaiah 8, verse 14, to show that for the unbeliever, the messianic stone was to be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. In the Isaiah passage that was discussed earlier, it was shown that Isaiah dealt with the contrast between the remnant and the non-remnant. And Peter concludes with an application in the second part of verse 8. The non-remnant indeed stumbled, for those who rejected the word were destined to stumble. Isaiah predicted that Emmanuel would be the point of division between the remnant and the non-remnant. Peter teaches that this has now taken place, and Yeshua the Messiah has become that new point of division. So what is the status of the remnant? We see this in 1 Peter 2, verses 9 to 10. This passage now concludes with a further description of the status of the remnant. But you, the remnant, are an elect race, a royal priesthood, holy nation, a people for God's own possession. Remember, Exodus 19, verses 5 to 6 is still in mind here. Peter now adds 4 other descriptions to show the position of the remnant in contrast to Israel the whole. First of all, they are an elect race. This is based on Isaiah 43, verse 20. Being elect shows that they were chosen at God's initiative. We see this in verse 4 and verse 6 of 1 Peter 2. This is a reference to their individual election. The use of the term race shows that Peter is also dealing with their national election. The church, however, is not a race. It is composed of believers from all races. Secondly, the remnant of Israel is a royal priesthood. In verse 5, the remnant was called a holy priesthood, emphasizing their right to approach the heavenly sanctuary. Now, they're also a royal priesthood. Since the high priest Jesus is a priest king after the order of Melchizedek, which we find in Hebrews 7, verses 1 to 28, these believers are therefore a royal priesthood, for they're both priests and kings. For now, they're functioning as priests. Hebrews 13, 15 to 16 tell us that. Hebrews 13, 15 to 16. But in the future, they'll function as kings exercising royal authority in the Messianic kingdom. And you see that in Revelation 5, verse 10 and Revelation 20, verse 6. Now, while it is true that all believers constitute a priesthood, the priesthood of all believers cannot legitimately be derived from this passage in 1 Peter 2. Rather, the concept of the priesthood of the believer is taught in Revelation 1, verse 6, Revelation 1, verse 6, Revelation 5, verse 10, and Revelation 20, verse 6. Thirdly, the believing Jewish remnant is a holy nation. Israel became a nation at Mount Sinai and was called upon to be holy and separated from sin to God. However, the nation as a whole failed, but the remnant has not failed. And again, the church is not a nation. Romans 10:19 tells us that. It is composed of believers from all nations. Fourthly, we see that they are a people for God's own possession. This is based not only on Exodus 19, 5 to 6, but also in Deuteronomy 7, verse 6 and 14, 2 and 26, 18, Isaiah 43, 21 and Malachi 3, 17 also. Now, while they became a nation at Mount Sinai, they became a people with Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. The remnant is God's own possession. So for those Jewish believers were purchased by the blood of the Messiah, and therefore they belong uniquely to God. 1 Peter 1, verses 18 to 19 tell us that. Now, having described the status of the remnant in this way, Peter next gives the purpose for their election in verse 9, second part of verse 9. That you may show forth the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So the background to this concept is in Isaiah 43, verse 20 to 21. They are to show forth the excellencies or the attributes of the God who called them out of darkness into his marvelous light. They are to proclaim the message to those outside. And then in verse 10, this section concludes with a reference to Hosea 1, verses 10 to chapter 2, verse 1 and 23. Who in time past, he says, were no people, but now are the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Formerly, these were part of the non-remnant spiritually. In time past, they were no people and had not obtained mercy. Now they are members of the remnant, they're the people of God, and now have obtained mercy. A bit of a summary. To summarize the status of the remnant, Peter is not drawing a distinction between Israel and the church, or between unbelieving Jews and believing Gentiles. That's not what he's doing here. The distinction here is between Jews who believe and Jews who do not believe. His point is that while Israel as a whole, Israel as a nation failed, the believing remnant of Israel has not failed. So the remnant of Israel is fulfilling the calling of the nation as a whole. And Paul will make the same point in his theology of Israel in Romans 9, 10, and 11. So now we come to Paul in Romans 9, verses 1 to 11, verse 24. Now, Chapters 9, 10, and 11 are sometimes skipped in commentaries in the book of Romans. And such commentators do not take what God says about Israel too seriously, and they teach that the church is the new Israel. They therefore do not feel that these chapters are important, or perhaps it's because of what Paul has to say here that contradicts their theology. These commentaries provide a verse-by-verse, word-by-word commentary covering chapters 1 to 8, then they skip over to chapters 12 to 16, totally dropping chapters 9, 10, and 11. Other commentary that do take these chapters somewhat seriously and do comment upon them will often refer to them as being merely parenthetical. They're not actually part of Paul's main argument. And before moving on to the exposition of this passage, there are three things to note by way of introduction. It is always wrong to ignore three chapters of scripture that God has put into the text, because he certainly must have had a reason for revealing it. Furthermore, chapters 9, 10, and 11 are not parenthetical. If anything, they're very pivotal, because they vindicate God's righteousness in his relationship to Israel. In chapters 1 to 8 of the book of Romans, Paul dealt with the theology of the righteousness of God after introducing the book in chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. He then spelled out the details of the theology of God's righteousness, and he pointed out that everyone has fallen short the righteous standards of God in chapters 1 to 3, including all sections of humanity, the pagan Gentiles in Romans 1, 18 to 32, the cultured Gentiles in Romans 2, 1 to 16, and the Jews in Romans 2, 17 to chapter 3, verse 18. Paul's conclusion in Romans 3, 19 to 31 is that all have sinned and have come short the righteousness of God. So having shown that everyone is a sinner, both Jews and Gentiles, and everyone has fallen short of the righteousness of God, Paul then describes what God has done in order to provide righteousness for men. He provided righteousness through salvation in Yeshua the Messiah. And this salvation has three aspects: past, present, and future. Past aspect of salvation is justification. We find this in Romans 4, verse 1 to 5, verse 21. Once one believes, he's justified or declared righteous by God. The present aspect of, that's the past aspect of salvation, justification. Present aspect of salvation is sanctification. Romans 6, verse 1 to 8, verse 18. Sanctification is the work of the Holy Spirit in believers' lives today, conforming the believer more and more into the image of the Son of God. The future aspect of salvation is glorification. We find this in Romans 8, 19 to 39. Glorification is guaranteed in light of the fact that believers have been justified and are being sanctified, and therefore someday will be glorified and be like him. The end of chapter 8, as he concludes the theology of God's righteousness, he points out that in light of all that God has done for believers in justification, sanctification, and glorification, there is absolutely nothing that can separate believers from the love of God. Nothing in heaven can separate them, nothing on earth, nothing below the earth, nothing outside of them, nothing inside of them, not even they themselves can separate believers from the love of God. Now, one would think that having stated all of this, Paul would then immediately proceed with the practice of God's righteousness. For example, we see in the book of Ephesians, he dealt with theology in chapters 1 to 3 and the practical application of that theology in chapters 4 to 6. Yet in the book of Romans, having spelled out the theology of God's righteousness, Paul did not immediately proceed to the practice of God's righteousness. Instead, between the theology of God's righteousness in chapters 1 to 8 and the practice of God's righteousness in chapters 12 to 16, he inserted 3 chapters dealing with God's righteousness in his relationship to Israel. Well, why did he have to do that? Because at the end of chapter 8, Paul concluded that in light of all that God has done, in light of his promises, there is nothing that can separate believers from the love of God. Now, at this point, some bright spark might say, hang on, but did not Israel have promises from God, and did not God make certain commitments to Israel, including national salvation and worldwide restoration. Yet the majority of Israel is in a state of unbelief. It does not seem that God's promises to Israel have been kept. If God's promises to Israel have not been kept, how can anyone really believe that there is nothing that can separate them from the love of God, since that seems to be the case with Israel? Therefore, Paul must now deal with the question of God's righteousness in his relationship to Israel. And for this reason, these 3 chapters should not be ignored as some commentators have chosen to do, nor should these chapters simply be viewed as merely parenthetical, not related to his argument. These 3 chapters, 9, 10, 11, should be considered pivotal in that they justify or vindicate God's righteousness in his relationship to Israel. They form a bridge between the theology of God's righteousness in chapters 1 to 8 and the practice of God's righteousness in chapters 12 to 16. And in these 3 chapters, 9, 10, and 11, Paul now explains a program for the remnant of Israel in the present age and how the remnant relates to both Israel and the church. Now, this is where we're going to leave it for this session, and we'll continue on in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.